Hello, does this ever happen to you? Let's stop this kind of thing from happening in the future. All you need to learn is how to analyze your kick and bass. And that is what I'm going to teach you in today's video. The most basic form of analysis that you can do is going to be waveform analysis, and that's what we're going to start out with here. Let's first start with a full track. This is my track Beyond. It sounds somewhat like this. You can hear that it's still a little bit of a nice and slow track. There's not much going on. There aren't many drums. There aren't many synth sounds. There's just the occasional one shot, which means that if we zoom in on the waveform, it's going to look very closely to an actual kick and bass on its own. Of course, there's still other stuff happening. We do need to keep that into account, but it's very easy to see the kick and to see two bass notes that are not playing simultaneously with the kick. Of course, the last bass note that forms the rolling bass pattern is going to be playing over here, but that is very hard to see, because the kick is much louder in this area. If we compare this with a very busy part of the track, something like this, you can see that it becomes much harder to see exactly what is going on. You can see the waveform overall, if we zoom in, is just much wider, and there's a lot more noise in the waveform, which means that it isn't as clear what is going on in the kick and bass. Now, this might be a problem for you if you're looking at a reference track. If you're trying to understand the details of the kick and bass, what is actually going on in a reference track, and you're just looking at the waveform to see what is happening, then there might be certain sections where you have better results than others. And of course, keep that in mind when doing these kind of checks. When it comes to what we are actually looking for though, usually when it comes to waveform analysis, we are looking at how cleanly separated the different elements of the kick and bass are. You can really divide up the beat into two sections. We have the kick section and then the bass section over here. Within the bass section with a rolling bass line, it is usually the case that there's two bass notes playing over here and over here. And you can see their individual transients over here as a little bit of extra, like very high frequency oscillation that then quickly rolls down into a more stable waveform. Now, not all kick and basses are going to look like this. This is going to be a wavetable bass line. If we compare this to a different track of mine, I can show you the differences of a wavetable bassline versus a normal bassline and how you can identify those. I'm just going to take this part over here. I'm going to quickly cut it here right before the kick, and we'll just drop this in and align it here so that we can see the differences. Notice that here the waveform is always doing the same thing, apart obviously from the transient over here. You can see that it's continuously the same shape in the way that it's going like this, whereas over here it takes a little bit of time for that oscillation to become stable. This is because in a wavetable bassline you cannot have a phase shift of over 180 degrees, whereas in normal bassline processing that is possible. Now, this is very technical. If you want to know what I'm actually talking about, you should check out my ultimate guide to kick and bass, in which I explain all of these things and much more in great detail. It is over 3 hours long though, so you're going to need a free afternoon. Anyway, going back into our waveform analysis, as I said before, we can essentially divide this up into two compartments. We have, again, the kick compartment over here and the bass compartment over here. And within the bass compartment, we can even say that there's two compartments because there's two notes playing here. For now, we're just looking at the standard rolling bassline. I'll also talk a little bit about different basslines, but I'll do that at the end of the video. Now, with these pockets, what we want to look for is we want to look for if the waveform stops nicely and goes to silence towards the end of this pocket. Because this kick is no longer playing, we free up all of the space for the bass note to start playing here. And then the bass note stops playing right here at the end, and we free up all of the space for this bass note to play over here. What we don't want is we don't want the kick to continue playing into this transient over here, and I actually see that a lot in different producers who do not look at the waveform of their kick and bass when designing it. Because this is not something you really hear, this is more something that comes out on bigger sound systems. And all of this has to do with phase shift, which again I talk about in the ultimate guide. I'm not going to explain the theory behind that one again here. For now, all that we will say is for your kick and bass to be considered clean in this sense, in the waveform sense, it means that every transient right before it goes to silence. So what we can see here is that for this kick, it is clean. We can see that it kind of rolls off here. Obviously, this isn't a full track, so there may be like slight differences in here. As you can see, this is a little bit lower. It also doesn't have to be this precise, obviously. We just want in general to have it go to silence right before the kick, which even at this rate we can see is happening. It's kind of moving in towards the center here. This is the center silence line. And you can see here it is the case as well. But towards the end here, you can see that this bass note kind of continues to play in here, and it's moving that transient down a little bit. And in this case, you could argue that you could clean this up a little bit more. To be honest, at this rate, I don't think it's that big of a problem. This is kind of in the area where it doesn't really matter if you fix it or not. It's like the very small details. Overall, when it comes to this kind of waveform analysis, this kind of cleaning, it is a small detail. It's an important small detail because it gets exaggerated when you're playing on a festival system, the problems that this issue can cause. But at this level, if it's not actually bleeding into the transient, it's not going to be that big of an issue. So that's the waveform check, and that is the main check that you do. The other check that you can do is the level of the kick relative to the bass. And we can just see it very easily here in a track like this. The bass line is a little bit quieter than the kick. The philosophy behind this is that we're dancing to the kick, so the kick is the most important part of the track. And that means that we want to make our bass line slightly quieter than the kick, so that that kick really draws the attention of the listener, especially in the low end. As you can see down below here, the low frequencies are just louder than they are over here. You can just see the waveform being bigger. Now there's one more waveform related check that you can do, but we cannot really do it on this waveform over here. Partially because this is a full kick and bass waveform, and partially because this is a mastered waveform as well, so this is really squashed. But the check that I'm talking about is phase alignment. Now I'm a little bit of a special boy when it comes to sidetrans production because I don't do phase alignment. Again, the ultimate guide will tell you why. I have my own way around the problem that completely avoids that altogether. But what phase alignment really entails is just lining up the kick and the bass in such a way that they sum well together. And summing is just the two elements adding, combining with each other. At the end of the day, a waveform is nothing more than just a bow of numbers. You can see the individual numbers over here if you zoom in enough. And it's just this array of numbers that just determines the value of the speaker cone at any given point in the track. So if you have two waveforms, you can just sum those numbers together. And that is really what summing is. So when I said there's another bass note playing over here, there's obviously not like a kick and a bass playing here. It's still one waveform. So they're kind of combining into one waveform, and then in our brain, we recognize that as, oh, there's a kick tail happening here, and then there's a bass note also playing. But that isn't actually the case in the waveform. So phase alignment is also easy to check in the waveform. The way that you would do that though is with a kick and the bass in separate waveforms. So for that you would use a tool something like Psyscope over here. Let's just set this up. I want to route this to the kick over here. And I want to route one of my basses to the bass. And now the fun thing about this plugin is that we're going to have both the kick and the bass in separate channels. We're using a different kick and bass for this, by the way. This is just one that I picked from our production. And we can see the kick in red and the bass line in green. There's a little bit of a hole here. There's a little bit of a gap. That is just because of how the plugin displays the waveform here when you stop playing it. But the way that you would do phase alignment is that you would line up the waveforms over here. Again, I have my own workaround, so there's no sub bass in this note over here, which means that for me, there's not an easy way to line these up. These waveforms aren't really like compatible with each other. Because for one, it means that the lowest fundamental is just missing here, and therefore you're not going to have this low sine wave that you want to line it up to. And it also means that for my kick, it allows me to not have a continuous pitch in here, which is usually a requirement for phase alignment. So normally what you would have is you would have your kick kind of coming down in pitch up until like this point over here. And then it would have a stable pitch note so that you can easily phase align with them. I don't do that because, again, I have this workaround. I get a lot more punch out of it, and it means that my kicks just sound different as well because I have the liberty of not having to do phase alignment. Now, for this final test, I quickly want to show you what it looks like if the kick and bass is not clean. So let's go into summing mode, which allows us to look at the kick and bass in one waveform. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to introduce some phase shift. The way that I'll do that is with an EQ here, and I'm just going to high pass this. This is the reason, by the way, why you shouldn't high pass your kick and bass. Let's also high pass the bass. And just for exaggeration, let's duplicate it over 2 times so that we get a little bit of extra effect. If we now look at the analyzer, you see that we no longer have those distinct pockets. You can see that over here, it is kind of bleeding into the bass line. There's no stop over here. And you can even see that the transient of the kick is completely washed out as well. It's completely destroyed here. You can go to layers and you can exactly see which part of the kick is lining up with which part of the bass, which is just being delayed by the filters. And here as well, you can see that the kick is bleeding into the baseline, which means that your kick is too long, again, as a result of the filters. Now, there's still more checks that you can do. At this point, I do feel the need to say that the main thing that you should be concerned about is still the sound. Like, it should sound good, but it should also work on the analyzers. Again, I showed you this example over here. There's this small uncleanliness here. I would argue you could remove that. But in this case, I decided that whatever was causing this imbalance was more important than this little bit of offset over here. In regards to the tone though, what you can do in terms of analyzing the kick and bass tone is you can just take a part where the kick and bass combine. So let's make a group for that. And then we'll use something like a spectrum analyzer to just look at the spectrum. We can have a look at this and we can compare that to other kicks and basses that we like, especially if we can find an isolated kick and bass, like I said before. We can just run it through the spectrum analyzers and you'll get a pretty good idea of what the frequency spectrum of this kick and bass is going to be. So for example, over here, this is the solo kick and bass that we've been listening to. And let's compare that with the track that we heard before. By the way, if you want to hear the full track, you can find it over at my label Eclipse Sound Syndicate. But you can see that the tonality, even though the track changes and different one-shots are playing, you can still see that the main tonality of the kick and bass is still in there. So what you could do to improve your kick and bass, partially, is just to try to match the spectrum of a kick and bass that you like to your own kick and bass. Now, up until this point, we have been looking at a very specific part of psytrance, as well as a very specific kick and bass, the rolling kick and bass. When it comes to other genres and other bass lines, the theory is still the same, but there's obviously going to be differences on how you apply that theory. Like for example, if you have a high-tech track, what you'll find is that the kick is actually much shorter and all three bass notes play at the same volume. So you get a 16-note pocket for the kick, a 16-note pocket for the first bass note, a 16-note pocket for the second bass note, and a 16-note pocket for the final bass note. Meaning that the waveform is just going to look a little bit different. And if you're making a different subgenre of psytrance still, you might have to do some investigative work on what your kick and basses should look like on an analyzer. Now that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed as well. Also, you can support the channel by watching more of my videos, so there should be 2 up on screen right now. That's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.